The midday sun mercilessly punished the training grounds of Camp Pendleton, where the asphalt radiated waves of heat that distorted vision like desert mirages. Dozens of Marines stood in perfect formation, awaiting the start of the precision shooting drills, their uniforms drenched in sweat as the drill sergeant barked orders that echoed across the military pavilions. It was just another day of brutal routine, where only the most accurate would survive the tests that separate ordinary soldiers from elite marksmen. No one expected that morning to become legendary in the history of the Marine Corps. Fate was about to arrive in a form none of them could have imagined. From the main gate, a solitary figure emerged, walking with measured, deliberate steps, carrying an equipment bag that looked as though it had survived decades of combat. The younger Marines cut off their conversations when they noticed something extraordinary. The man carried a sniper rifle painted in shocking pink, gleaming under the California sun like a flamingo lost among a murder of crows. Stifled laughter began to spread through the ranks as soldiers whispered among themselves, some discreetly pointing at the weapon that defied every known military convention. The veteran, appearing to be in his well-lived 60s, seemed completely indifferent to the reactions his arrival provoked. His eyes remained fixed on the firing range ahead, as if he already knew exactly where this journey would lead him. "Look what the cat dragged in," muttered Corporal Martinez, one of the unit's most respected shooters, nudging the soldier beside him. "Somebody must have told Grandpa we're holding a beauty pageant here, not real military training." Now the laughter intensified as other Marines joined the mockery, creating a chorus of sarcastic comments that cut through the hot air like sharp blades. The drill sergeant frowned, clearly torn between enforcing discipline and letting his men ease the tension through humor, but something about the veteran's bearing unsettled him, a stillness that did not belong to someone who should have been intimidated by the circumstances. The man finally stopped a few meters from the firing line, placed his bag on the ground with an almost reverential care, and began assembling his gear with precise movements that spoke of decades of automatic practice. Each gesture was executed with a military efficiency that clashed drastically with the eccentric appearance of his weapon, creating a cognitive dissonance that left the observers even more intrigued. General Thompson, watching from the command pavilion, adjusted his binoculars and murmured something inaudible to his aide-de-camp. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. At that moment, no one suspected they were about to witness one of the most impossible shots in American military history. The veteran slowly lifted his head, and his eyes scanned the training field with the precision of a military radar, sweeping hostile territory, capturing every detail, every movement, every nuance of the environment around him. It was as if he were mentally photographing not just the physical terrain, but also the energy of the men surrounding him, their doubts, their prejudices, their unspoken expectations. When his gaze finally settled on the Marines who were still whispering disparaging comments, there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep understanding that they were about to learn a lesson they would carry for the rest of their military careers. The silence that followed was so dense, it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. Something in the man's expression made even the bravest soldiers swallow their next jokes. His hands, marked with scars that told stories of battles in distant lands, moved over the pink rifle with an intimacy that bordered on the sacred, each touch revealing a connection that transcended the normal bond between soldier and weapon. His fingers traced the contours of the customized stock with movements that seemed part of an ancestral ritual, while his lips moved silently in words no one could decipher. It was impossible not to notice how that seemingly ridiculous weapon responded to his touch, as if it were an extension of his own body, molded by years of partnership in situations where death was the only alternative to absolute success. Corporal Martinez stopped laughing when he realized his own hands trembled slightly, an involuntary reaction to the intensity of concentration radiating from the veteran. Mockery was quickly transforming into something much closer to reluctant respect. General Thompson slowly descended the steps of the command pavilion, his footsteps echoing with the authority of 3 decades of military leadership. But there was a genuine curiosity in his movements that did not go unnoticed by the more seasoned soldiers. He had seen thousands of marksmen throughout his career, nervous recruits, confident veterans, arrogant specialists, but he had never witnessed this particular combination of supernatural calm and meticulous preparation that the man with the pink rifle displayed. When the general stopped just a few feet from the veteran, the air between them seemed charged with static electricity, as if 2 forces of nature were recognizing one another. "Soldier," said the general, his voice firm yet respectful, "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into here." The veteran finally raised his eyes, and for a brief moment, Thompson saw something in that gaze that made his heart race. "With all due respect, General," the veteran replied in a hoarse voice that carried the weight of 1,000 untold battles, "I know exactly where I am and why I came here today." His words were spoken with an unshakable certainty that made several Marines involuntarily straighten their postures, as if standing in the presence of something far greater than they had initially realized. The wind shifted again, this time carrying a heavy silence that seemed to announce the true test was only beginning. The training field, which moments earlier had echoed with laughter and casual chatter, now vibrated with a palpable tension that made every man present question his initial assumptions. No one laughed at the pink rifle anymore. Now, all eyes were fixed on the man who wielded it with a confidence that defied convenient logic. The drill sergeant, a man whose voice had shaped thousands of soldiers over 2 decades of service, stepped forward and announced the rules of the exercise with an authority that cut through the rising tension like a hot blade through butter. Today we'll be testing long-distance shooting skills, starting with targets at 1,000 meters, then 2, 3, 4, and for those bold enough, he paused dramatically, letting his words echo, 5,000 meters, a distance that only a handful of marksmen in the world can hit with precision. The younger Marines exchanged nervous glances, knowing that even the best among them rarely struck targets beyond 3,000 meters under ideal conditions. The veteran continued adjusting his equipment with methodical movements, seemingly immune to the psychological pressure the sergeant was trying to build. Something about the man's absolute composure made even the most experienced soldiers begin to wonder if they were gravely underestimating the situation. "Bets are open, boys," shouted Private Jenkins, an arrogant Texan known for his exceptional aim and even sharper tongue, as he waved a $20 bill in the air like a battle flag. $20 says Grandpa and his doll rifle won't even hit the first target." The provocation unleashed a wave of laughter and sarcastic comments that swept across the field like an uncontrolled wildfire, with soldiers shouting their own wagers and progressively raising the stakes. But as the numbers grew and the pressure mounted, a subtle change began to creep into the atmosphere. The laughter sounded a little more forced, the comments a little less confident. The veteran remained unmoved, a solid rock amid a stormy sea of doubts and bravado. When he finally spoke, his voice sliced through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. "Place your bets, boys. But remember, some lessons can only be learned when pride collides with reality." General Thompson felt an inexplicable shiver run down his spine when he heard those words, recognizing in them an echo of wisdom that only comes from experiences most men never face and survive to tell. He had commanded soldiers in 3 different conflicts, had seen heroes born and die within seconds, but there was something about this veteran that stirred an ancient memory in his mind. Fragments of whispered stories in military bases, urban legends about phantom snipers who appeared in the most desperate moments of combat. "Soldier," said the general, his voice carrying a formality that could not quite mask his growing curiosity. "Before we begin, it would be appropriate to know your name and unit of origin." The veteran paused in his preparations, lifted his eyes to meet the general's, and for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, the two men measured each other like gladiators before the arena. The answer that followed made several soldiers present involuntarily hold their breath. "James Morrison, sir," replied the veteran with a simplicity that contrasted dramatically with the emotional weight his words seemed to carry. "I served where it was needed, when it was needed." It was an answer that said everything and nothing at once, the kind of non-answer that men with classified histories learn to give when questioned about their past. The general nodded slowly, recognizing the unwritten code that governs certain kinds of soldiers, those whose contributions to national security will never appear in history books or award ceremonies. The wind carried with it a moment of respectful silence as every man present processed the possibility that they might be in the presence of something far more significant than they had initially imagined. The laughter had ceased completely now, replaced by an expectant tension that made the air vibrate with unexplored possibilities. Morrison turned his attention back to the pink rifle, and for the first time, some of the Marines began to wonder if the color of that weapon was in fact a symbol of something much deeper than mere eccentricity. The first target at 1,000 meters fell like an autumn leaf touched by a gentle breeze, the bullet's impact creating a burst of dust that dissipated to reveal a hole perfectly centered in the heart of the metal disc. The silence that followed was so complete that even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself recognized that something exceptional had just occurred before their eyes. Morrison displayed no emotion, no satisfaction, no relief, no pride. He simply reloaded his weapon with the same methodical precision a conductor uses to lead a symphony he knows by heart. Corporal Martinez swallowed hard and muttered to his companion, "That was beginner's luck," but his trembling voice betrayed the growing anxiety corroding his initial confidence. General Thompson adjusted his binoculars, his fingers tightening around the lenses with an intensity that revealed his curiosity had transformed into something much closer to genuine fascination. The second target at 2,000 meters shattered into a rain of metallic fragments that glittered under the sun like deadly confetti, each piece carrying away another fragment of the collective arrogance of the Marines, who now watched in deepening silence. Morrison lowered the rifle for just a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon with the patience of a predator, intimately familiar with the value of waiting, before repositioning it for the next challenge with movements that flowed like water over polished stones. The wagers that had been placed with such enthusiasm only minutes earlier now seemed to weigh like lead in their owners' pockets as reality methodically dismantled each preconceived assumption. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the metallic scent of burnt gunpowder and something else indefinable, perhaps the smell of destiny approaching with inevitable steps. No one dared mention the pink color of the rifle anymore. Now, that weapon had become an instrument of precision, commanding absolute respect. Morrison closed his eyes, and his breathing became so controlled it seemed he had entered a state of deep meditation, where each inhale lasted exactly 4 seconds, and each exhale released not just air, but all the tension accumulated in muscles trained to function as components of a lethal precision machine. His hands found positions on the pink rifle that seemed to have been sculpted specifically for his fingers over years of obsessive practice, each point of contact revealing an intimacy that transcended the normal relationship between marksman and weapon. The silence around him deepened until it became almost solid, as if the training ground itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to happen. When Morrison finally opened his eyes, they held a crystalline clarity that made several Marines instinctively step back, recognizing that they were witnessing the transformation of an ordinary man into something far more dangerous and focused. The moment had arrived for the impossible shot, 5,000 meters of distance that would forever separate true masters from mere practitioners. The preparation ritual that followed was executed with a choreographic precision that mesmerized every observer, each movement flowing into the next, like parts of a deadly dance perfected over decades of repetition on battlefields where a millimeter of error meant the difference between life and death. Morrison adjusted the scope with touches so delicate that his fingers seemed to caress the metal rather than manipulate it, his eyes calculating invisible variables: wind speed, air humidity, Earth's rotation, barometric pressure, with a mastery that transformed complex physics into pure intuition. General Thompson felt his heart race as he realized he was not merely witnessing an exceptional marksman, but an artist working within his most intimate and personal medium. The pink rifle, which moments earlier had been the object of mockery, now rested in Morrison's hands as an extension of his very soul, ready to deliver a message that would travel 5 kilometers through the California air to meet its inevitable destiny. Morrison's finger found the trigger with the delicacy of a pianist, playing the final note of a career-defining concerto, and for a moment suspended in time, the entire training field seemed to exist in a state of frozen animation where even the molecules of air hesitated to move. The shot echoed through the military base like a solitary thunderclap in a clear sky, reverberating against the distant buildings and creating a symphony of echoes that carried the weight of decades of military experience condensed into a single high-velocity bullet. Morrison remained as still as a marble statue, the rifle still pressed against his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where a tiny target awaited the verdict of physics and fate. The silence that followed was so deep and heavy with tension that several soldiers realized they were involuntarily holding their breath, as if the very act of breathing might somehow interfere with the bullet's trajectory, now slicing through the air at over 800 meters per second. General Thompson raised his binoculars with hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from an electric anticipation that sent his blood racing faster through his veins. 6 eternal seconds passed as the bullet traveled its impossible journey through layers of air, constantly shifting in density and temperature, every millisecond of flight representing a mathematical calculation so complex that military supercomputers would need minutes to process all the variables involved. The soldier manning the observation scope at the distant target remained in dead silence, his eyes glued to the lenses as he awaited the impact that would determine whether he had just witnessed a miracle of ballistics or simply another ambitious attempt that would end buried in the dirt, meters short of its mark. Morrison finally lowered the rifle, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon with a confidence so absolute it bordered on the supernatural, as if he already knew the outcome before the confirmation arrived through the military radios. The wind died completely, creating a stillness that seemed to announce that something monumentally significant was about to be revealed. Then through the heavy silence, the radio crackled with a trembling voice that would make history on the base. Target hit dead center. I repeat, direct hit in the absolute center. General Thompson felt his legs weaken as realization struck him like lightning on a clear night. He knew that name, James Morrison, but not from conventional service reports or personnel files that crossed his desk regularly. The name was etched in his memory through reverent whispers in classified briefing rooms. Stories told only among the highest-ranking officers about a phantom marksman who had saved entire missions with impossible shots in places that didn't even officially exist on Pentagon maps. "My God," Thompson murmured, his voice heavy with a volatile mix of admiration and disbelief. "You're the pink ghost of Kandahar." "Drew." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to have physical substance, as every Marine present slowly processed the meaning of those words that instantly transformed their understanding of the man standing before them. Morrison finally turned, his eyes meeting the general's with an expression that mixed profound weariness with an unshakable dignity that had survived horrors most men couldn't imagine in their worst nightmares. The rifle was hers, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of a pain so deep it made several soldiers instinctively lower their heads in respect, each word emerging as if torn from wounds that had never fully healed. My daughter, Sarah Morrison, corporal in the Marine Corps, killed in action in Afghanistan 5 years ago, a victim of an ambush she should never have faced alone. The shocking pink of the rifle suddenly made devastating sense. It wasn't an eccentricity or provocation, but a living memorial, a declaration of paternal love that turned every shot into a prayer and every hit into a tribute to the memory of a daughter who had given her life for the country that now mocked the color of her weapon. Tears began to roll silently down the faces of battle-hardened soldiers as Morrison continued. She painted this rifle pink because she said she wanted the enemies to know they were being taken down by an American girl who feared nothing and no one. General Thompson slowly removed his cap, a gesture immediately mirrored by everyone present, transforming the training field into an improvised sanctuary where mourning and honor stood in perfect harmony. General Thompson swallowed the knot that had formed in his throat and stepped forward, his movements heavy with the weight of 3 decades of military leadership and the recognition that he was standing before a living legend who had sacrificed more for his country than any man should ever be asked to bear. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice trembling slightly with restrained emotion, "it is an indescribable honor to have you with us today. And I ask forgiveness on behalf of us all for the initial lack of respect. We didn't know. We didn't understand the sacred meaning of what we were seeing." His words echoed across the field like a public confession, acknowledging not only their collective misjudgment, but also the depth of ignorance that had led trained men sworn to protect freedom to mock its purest symbol. Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the faces of the young Marines, who now looked at him with a mixture of shame, admiration, and newfound respect that completely transformed the atmosphere. The pink rifle in his hands was no longer an object of curiosity or disdain. It had become a portable altar, dedicated to the supreme sacrifice that defines the very essence of military service. Every Marine present felt the weight of the lesson they had just learned about the dangerous nature of superficial judgment and the importance of recognizing that great stories often come wrapped in appearances that defy conventional expectations. Corporal Martinez, who had led the initial mockery, stepped forward with tears in his eyes and executed the most perfect salute of his military career, a gesture immediately followed by every other soldier until the entire field became a forest of raised hands in silent salute. Morrison returned the salute with a precision that spoke of decades of military discipline. Yet in his movement there was a paternal gentleness that acknowledged these young men had just aged several years in the span of minutes. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that felt fitting for a moment destined to be remembered and retold on military bases around the world. In that instant, everyone understood they had just witnessed not merely an extraordinary shot, but a masterclass in honor, sacrifice, and the true nature of strength. Not in outward appearance, but in the depth of character forged through loss and the determination to honor those who came before us. In the days that followed that transformative moment, the story of the 5,000-meter shot spread across the military base like ripples on a still lake, each retelling adding layers of reverence and understanding about the true meaning of what had happened on that golden afternoon. Corporal Martinez sought out Morrison 3 days later, carrying a handwritten letter he had rewritten 7 times, until he finally found the right words to express his shame and his sincere plea for forgiveness, only to discover that the veteran had left quietly the night before, leaving behind nothing but a note that read, "Thank you for letting Sarah fire one more time through me." And those simple words carried an emotional weight that made Martinez understand forgiveness had already been granted the moment Morrison chose to see young soldiers learning instead of young soldiers mocking. General Thompson ordered that a commemorative plaque be placed on the shooting range, not celebrating the distance record that might never again be broken, but honoring the memory of Sarah Morrison and the lesson on judgment her father had taught through his extraordinary demonstration of skill and grace. New recruits arriving at the base were brought before that plaque and told the full story, ensuring that the lesson of humility and respect would live on through future generations of Marines. The color pink gradually became a respected symbol throughout the base, appearing in small details: a stripe on a helmet, a discreet patch, a ribbon tied to equipment, as silent reminders that true strength often comes disguised in forms that defy our most basic expectations. General Thompson himself kept a small paper rose on his desk, a daily reminder that effective leadership requires the humility to recognize when we are wrong and the wisdom to transform our mistakes into opportunities for growth for everyone around us. The soldiers who had witnessed that day carried with them a new perspective on judgment and respect, applying those lessons not only in their military lives, but in every human interaction that followed. The military base had become a slightly different place, more compassionate, more aware, more prepared to recognize that true heroes rarely announce themselves with fanfare, preferring instead to let their actions speak in moments when we least expect their greatness. The echo of that impossible shot continued to reverberate through time, not as a physical sound, but as a spiritual vibration, reminding all that genuine sacrifice for others is the purest form of strength that exists in the universe. Years later, when graying veterans gathered in bars near military bases and conversations inevitably drifted towards stories of fallen comrades and moments that defined their careers, the legend of the Pink Ghost of Kandahar and his impossible 5,000-meter shot was told with an almost religious reverence that transcended military branches and generations of soldiers. The story had become more than a tale of extraordinary ballistic precision. It had evolved into a modern parable about how paternal love can transform unbearable pain into transcendent purpose, proving that the dead continue to fight through those who refuse to let their memories fade into the silence of oblivion. James Morrison was never again seen on any American military base, but his spiritual presence lived on through every marksman who paused before judging, every soldier who looked beyond superficial appearances, every leader who learned to recognize greatness, even when it arrived disguised in forms that defied conventional expectations. The pink rifle had become an eternal symbol etched into the collective consciousness of the Marine Corps, not as a weapon, but as a beacon, illuminating the fundamental truth that authentic strength is born of unconditional love and manifests through the courage to honor those who came before us. Somewhere in the remote mountains of the country, Morrison still carried that sacred rifle, each shot a whispered prayer, each hit a renewed promise that Sarah Morrison would live forever through the deadly precision of a father who had turned his deepest pain into the purest form of devotion. Just as the sun sets every evening only to rise again the following morning, Sarah Morrison's sacrifice continued to be reborn through every life her story touched, every prejudice her memory challenged, every moment of judgment her remembrance transformed into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The true miracle of that day on the training field had not been the bullet that traveled 5,000 meters through the Californian air with impossible precision. It had been the transformation of hearts hardened by war, hearts that learned to see beyond the surface and discovered that the truest heroes are those who carry their deepest battles in silence, honoring the dead through actions that speak louder than words ever could. Pink, once the object of mockery, had become an eternal declaration that love knows no boundaries of gender, that strength requires no external validation, and that sometimes the most important shots we fire in life are not aimed at our enemies, but at the barriers of ignorance and prejudice that prevent us from recognizing greatness when it walks among us disguised as ordinary. patiently waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the extraordinary depth of its true nature.